In this video, we'll explore the life of Princess Elisabeth of Romania, a name that for many might not immediately ring a bell, and that is the very core of her tragedy. She was born to be a queen, she wore a crown, and then she lost it all, retreating into a life that few could ever have imagined for a woman of her birth. From the lavish palaces of Bucharest to the sun-drenched but ultimately lonely shores of Cannes, Elisabeth's life was a testament to the fragile nature of power, the enduring weight of expectation, and the quiet, often unseen battles fought within the human heart. So let's pull back the velvet curtain of history and uncover the extraordinary and ultimately tragic life of a princess who fell from a throne and faded into the shadows. To truly understand Elisabeth, we must first cast our minds back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a time far removed from our own, yet pregnant with the seeds of modern Europe. This was the twilight of empires, a period when ancient monarchies still held sway, but the rumblings of nationalism, social change, and global conflict were growing louder. It was an era of stark contradictions, immense wealth and grinding poverty, rigid social hierarchies and revolutionary ideas, the last gasps of the old world and the birth pangs of the new. Elisabeth was born on October 12, 1894, in the breathtakingly beautiful Pelish Castle, a fairy tale concoction of timber and turrets nestled in the Carpathian Mountains of Romania. She was born into the Romanian royal family, a branch of the German house of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen, who had been imported in 1866 to rule the newly forming nation. This is a crucial detail. Like many Balkan monarchies, Romania's royals were a foreign dynasty, tasked with creating a sense of national identity and stability in a region often called the powder keg of Europe. Her great-uncle, King Carol I, was a stern, disciplined German prince who had, through sheer force of will, transformed the fledgling nation into a respected kingdom. He built Pelish Castle not as a traditional Romanian palace, but as a nostalgic, neo-Renaissance German fantasy, a symbol of the Western European power and culture he hoped to instill in his adopted land. It was a magnificent statement, but it was also a constant reminder that the family was, in origin, not of the soil they ruled. Her parents were Crown Prince Ferdinand and the famously beautiful and charismatic Crown Princess Marie. Her father, Ferdinand, was King Carol's nephew, a shy, serious, and somewhat awkward German prince who lived in the immense shadow of his imposing uncle. He was partially deaf in one ear, which added to his social discomfort, and he found solace not in politics or military parades, but in his passion for botany. He was a gentle, well-meaning man, but he was destined to be overshadowed, first by his uncle and then by his extraordinary wife. Elisabeth's mother, Marie, was a force of nature. Born Princess Marie of Edinburgh, she was a granddaughter of both Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom and Tsar Alexander II of Russia. She was English royalty, injected into the heart of the Balkans. Marie was dazzling, intelligent, artistic, and possessed an iron will that belied her stunning beauty. Trapped in a lonely marriage with the timid Ferdinand, she refused to fade into the background. Instead, she threw herself into her role as the future Queen of Romania, embracing the culture, learning the language, and captivating the people with her charm and flair. She became a pivotal figure in the nation's history, a brilliant diplomat and a fierce patriot for her adopted country. This larger-than-life mother would cast an immense and often cold shadow over Elisabeth's entire existence. Marie was the sun around which the Romanian court revolved, and her children were the planets. But Elisabeth, born second, after her dynamic and handsome older brother Carol was a quiet, serious, and rather plain child. From her earliest years, she seemed to recede into the background, eclipsed by her glamorous mother and her more outgoing siblings. Her world was one of immense privilege: palaces, governesses, summers at the Black Sea, but it was also a world of intense scrutiny and unspoken comparisons. She was a princess in an era when a princess's primary value lay in her beauty, her charm, and her ability to secure a powerful marriage. For a shy, introverted girl who was considered the ugly duckling of the family, this was a heavy burden to bear from the very beginning. Elisabeth's childhood and young adulthood were a study in contrasts. While the Romanian court, especially under her mother's influence, was vibrant and increasingly important on the European stage, Elisabeth remained a peripheral figure within her own family. She was given the classical education befitting a princess of her station, becoming fluent in several languages, including English, French, German, and Romanian, and was well versed in arts and literature. She developed a particular talent for painting and playing the piano, pursuits that allowed her to express herself in a way that her reserved personality often could not. These were solitary passions, activities she could engage with alone, away from the judgment and social demands of court life. However, the accounts of those who knew her paint a picture of a difficult and complex young woman. Her own mother, Queen Marie, in her famously candid diaries, wrote of Elisabeth, or Elisabetha, as she was known in the family, with a mixture of love, frustration, and bewilderment. She described her eldest daughter as having a closed-up character, being secretive, and possessing a deep-seated sensitivity that often manifested as sullenness or coldness. In one particularly revealing passage, Marie wrote, "Elisabetha is a strange, incomprehensible creature, and one suffers to feel that one's own child has a heart that is a sealed book." This is a heartbreaking admission from a mother, suggesting a profound emotional gulf between the two. Marie, who thrived on connection and emotional expression, simply could not understand her quiet, withdrawn daughter. This emotional distance created a painful rift. While Marie was a celebrated beauty and a charismatic public figure, Elisabeth was perceived as lacking grace and charm. She was often compared unfavorably to her younger, prettier sisters, Marie, Mignon, who was seen as the sweet one, and Ileana, who was the family favorite. This constant comparison, both within the family and by the press, undoubtedly deepened Elisabeth's insecurities and fostered a sense of inadequacy that would plague her for life. She retreated further into herself, earning a reputation for being haughty, aloof, and even cold, a defense mechanism for a young woman who felt she could never live up to the impossible standards set by her mother. She built walls around herself, and those walls would, in time, become her prison. Her relationship with her siblings was equally complex. Her older brother Carol, the heir to the throne, was charming, intelligent, but also notoriously unstable and selfish. His scandalous love affairs would repeatedly throw the family into crisis. While Elisabeth was outwardly dutiful and proper, she harbored a quiet jealousy of the freedom, however destructive, that Carol seemed to claim for himself. She was the responsible one, the quiet one, but she received little of the attention or affection that was lavished on her more troublesome brother or her prettier younger sisters. This sense of being an outsider in her own family defined her formative years. Her life was a lonely one, spent in the opulent but emotionally sterile environment of the royal palaces. She learned early on to rely on no one but herself, to suppress her emotions, and to expect disappointment. These were the lessons that would shape the woman and the queen she was to become. They would forge in her a steely resilience, but they would also rob her of the capacity for warmth and joy, leaving her ill-equipped for the personal and political trials that lay ahead. The world was on the brink of a cataclysmic war, an event that would temporarily give her a sense of purpose, but it would also be the final chapter of her youth before the inescapable duty of a royal marriage came to claim her. When we last left Princess Elisabeth of Romania, she was a young woman on the precipice of a world in flames, a quiet, introverted, and often overlooked figure within her own dynamic family. She had spent her youth in the immense shadow of her beautiful and charismatic mother, Queen Marie. Described as having a heart that is a sealed book, Elizabeth had built walls of reserve and coldness around a sensitive soul, a defense against a world in which she felt perpetually inadequate. She was dutiful, proper, and deeply lonely, but the personal dramas of the Romanian court were about to be dwarfed by a global cataclysm. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914 lit the fuse of the powder keg of Europe, and the First World War erupted, an event that would irrevocably alter the map of the continent and the course of Elizabeth's life. For the first 2 years of the Great War, Romania remained precariously neutral. King Carol I, Elizabeth's stern great-uncle, was German by birth and sentiment, but the Romanian people and much of its political class were overwhelmingly pro-Entente, pro-Allied. The country was torn between its dynastic loyalties and its national aspirations, particularly the dream of liberating the Romanian-speaking territories of Transylvania from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The old king, heartbroken by the conflict that pitted his homeland against his adopted country, died in late 1914, and Elizabeth's quiet, botanist father ascended the throne as King Ferdinand I. The decision of whether to enter the war now fell to him and his formidable wife. Queen Marie, with her deep British and Russian roots, was passionately pro-Allied. She lobbied tirelessly, using all of her charm and political acumen to push Romania into the war on the side of the Entente. In August 1916, she succeeded. Romania declared war on Austria-Hungary, an act that King Ferdinand, despite his Hohenzollern blood, signed off on, famously declaring, "I have vanquished my own blood." For the royal family, this was no distant conflict. It was an all-consuming reality. Queen Marie transformed herself into the mother of Romania, becoming a national icon. She worked tirelessly on the front lines, organizing field hospitals, comforting wounded soldiers, and staring down death and disease with breathtaking courage. And in her wake, she brought her daughters. For Princess Elisabeth, now in her early 20s, the war was a brutal but transformative experience. Pulled from her sheltered life of painting and piano, she was thrust into the heart of the national struggle. Along with her mother and sisters, she trained as a Red Cross nurse and was assigned to work in the hospitals of Bucharest. The initial Romanian military campaign was a disaster. The Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, quickly overran much of the country, forcing the government and the royal family to flee the capital and retreat to the city of Iași in Moldavia, the small northeastern part of the country that remained unoccupied. The conditions in Iași were horrific. It was a city overflowing with refugees, wounded soldiers, and the sick. A devastating typhus epidemic spread by lice swept through the crowded population, killing hundreds of thousands. It was in this crucible of suffering that Elizabeth found a new grim purpose. Every day she would put on her nurse's uniform and work long, grueling hours in the makeshift hospitals. She faced the horrors of war head-on: catastrophic injuries, rampant disease, and constant, overwhelming death. She dressed wounds, comforted the dying, and helped fight the typhus outbreak, even getting infected with a milder form of the disease herself. This period stripped away the trappings of royalty and revealed a different side of her character. Her quiet, serious, and diligent nature, which had been a social liability in the glittering ballrooms of Bucharest, became a profound asset in the chaos of the hospital wards. She was disciplined, tireless, and unflinching in her duties. Her mother, Queen Marie, for all their difficulties, recognized her daughter's strength during this time, noting her courage and her capacity for hard work. For the first time in her life, Elisabeth was not just the plain or difficult princess, she was a vital part of a national cause, her worth measured not by her charm, but by her service. It was a brief, terrible, yet deeply meaningful chapter in her life, a moment when the sealed book of her heart was opened not to joy, but to a profound sense of shared human suffering. The war eventually turned in the Allies' favor. With the collapse of the Central Powers in 1918, Romania emerged on the winning side. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, Queen Marie played a starring role, charming world leaders like Woodrow Wilson and Georges Clemenceau, and helping to secure the creation of Greater Romania, which now included Transylvania and other territories. The country had doubled in size, the Hohenzollern dynasty was more powerful than ever, and with the return of peace, the focus of the court returned to more traditional matters. The princesses who had been nurses were now once again valuable assets on the European marriage market. For Elisabeth, the sense of purpose she had found in the war was about to be replaced by the familiar suffocating weight of dynastic duty. In the intricate game of royal matchmaking, Queen Marie was a grandmaster. With her country's newfound prestige, she sought to forge powerful alliances that would secure Romania's position in the new post-war Europe. Her gaze fell upon the neighboring kingdom of Greece. A double marriage was proposed that would weave the two orthodox royal families of the Balkans together. Elisabeth's charismatic but troublesome older brother, Crown Prince Carol, was to marry the beautiful Princess Helen of Greece, and Elisabeth, now in her mid-20s, was betrothed to Helen's brother, Prince George, the Diadochos Crown Prince of Greece. On paper, the match was a stroke of diplomatic genius. It promised to create a powerful regional bloc, a bulwark against the political instability that was sure to follow the collapse of the old empires. For Queen Marie, it was a personal and political triumph. For Elisabeth, it was a catastrophe. From the moment she met him, Elisabeth was profoundly unhappy with the match. George was a man cast in a similar mold to her own father, quiet, serious, dutiful, and utterly lacking in passion or charisma. He was a product of a rigid military upbringing, a melancholic and somewhat ponderous man whose main interests were his uniforms and the minutiae of court protocol. He was, in short, everything Elisabeth found dull and uninspiring. Their personalities, both introverted and emotionally reserved, did not complement each other. They simply canceled each other out, creating an atmosphere of cold, awkward silence. There was no spark, no meeting of minds, no affection. Elisabeth, who had a romantic and artistic soul hidden beneath her icy exterior, was horrified. She reportedly pleaded with her mother, confiding that she felt no connection to George and was filled with dread at the prospect of marrying him. But Queen Marie, for whom duty had always trumped personal feelings, was unmoved. She had endured her own difficult marriage for the sake of the crown, and she expected her daughter to do the same. In Marie's worldview, a princess's happiness was a secondary consideration to the stability and prestige of the dynasty. Elisabeth's protests were brushed aside. The engagement was announced in 1920, and the preparations for a grand state wedding began. Elizabeth, who had faced down a typhus epidemic with courage, now had to face a future she saw as a life sentence. The wedding took place on February 27, 1921, in a grand Orthodox ceremony in Bucharest. Elizabeth, at the age of 26, became the crown princess of Greece. Just a few weeks later, her brother Carol married George's sister Helen in Athens. The double alliance was sealed. Elizabeth left her home, her family, and the country she had served during the war, and sailed for Athens to begin her new life. It was a life that would be marked by profound loneliness, political chaos, and personal misery. Her arrival in Greece was anything but a fairy tale. The Greek court was a snake pit of political intrigue and bitter family rivalries. The country was still reeling from the national schism, a deep political divide between the supporters of the monarchy, led by George's father, King Constantine I, and the Republicans, led by the charismatic Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos. The atmosphere was one of paranoia and instability. Elizabeth, a foreigner in a strange land, found herself completely isolated. She made little effort to bridge the gap. Her natural reserve, which had always been a part of her character, was now interpreted by the Greek people as arrogance and coldness. She was seen as a haughty foreign princess who looked down on her new country. She struggled to learn the Greek language, a failure that was seen as a sign of disrespect. She showed little interest in her public duties, preferring the solitude of her private apartments in the Tatoi Palace, where she would spend her days painting or playing the piano. She was desperately homesick, writing long, unhappy letters to her mother in Romania, letters that were often filled with complaints about her husband and her new life. The marriage, which had begun without love, quickly deteriorated into a state of mutual resentment. George, for his part, made no effort to understand his sensitive and unhappy wife. He was absorbed in the political crises engulfing his country and had little time or inclination for emotional connection. They were two lonely people trapped in a union that brought neither of them any comfort. The fact that they had no children only added to the sense of failure and emptiness that pervaded their marriage. Elizabeth's unhappiness was so profound that it began to manifest in physical symptoms. She was plagued by a series of illnesses, including typhoid fever, pleurisy, and nervous breakdowns, which many at the time believed were psychosomatic in origin, a physical expression of her deep mental and emotional distress. She was withering away, a flower transplanted to foreign soil, unable to take root. And then the ground beneath her feet gave way completely. In September 1922, the Greek army suffered a catastrophic defeat in its war against Turkey. The disaster led to a military coup, and the army turned against the monarchy, whom they blamed for the defeat. On September 27, 1922, King Constantine I was forced to abdicate for a second time to save the dynasty. Elizabeth's husband, George, ascended the shattered throne as King George II of the Hellenes. Elizabeth was now officially Queen of Greece, but it was a crown of thorns. Her reign was to be one of the shortest and most miserable in modern history. The new revolutionary government held all the real power and was deeply hostile to the monarchy. George was a king in name only, a virtual prisoner in his own palace. After just over a year of this powerless, humiliating existence, on December 19th, 1923, the government asked King George II and Queen Elizabeth to leave the country. Their departure was, in reality, an expulsion. The monarchy was formally abolished by a plebiscite a few months later. Elizabeth had been a queen for a mere 15 months. Now, she was an exiled ex-queen. Her brief, unhappy, and utterly pointless reign was over. When we last saw Princess Elizabeth, she was a queen without a country. Her 15-month reign as Queen of the Hellenes, a period of intense political turmoil, personal illness, and profound unhappiness, had ended abruptly in December 1923 with her and her husband, King George II, being forced into exile. Stripped of her crown and her purpose, she returned to the one place that had always been her home, yet never truly felt like it, Romania. This next chapter of Elizabeth's life would be a long, slow drift into obscurity, a period defined by the final bitter collapse of her marriage, a surprising and controversial foray into the world of finance, and a retreat into a self-imposed exile that would become her final, lonely sanctuary. The return to Romania was, for Elizabeth, a complex and bittersweet homecoming. On the one hand, she was back in the familiar surroundings of her youth within the sphere of her powerful family. On the other hand, she returned not as a triumphant queen, but as a political failure, a symbol of a collapsed monarchy. Her husband, George, found the situation even more humiliating. He was a king without a throne, living on the sufferance of his wife's family in Bucharest. He was a proud, rigid man, and the dependent role he was forced to play chafed at his pride, making him even more withdrawn and melancholic. The couple's already fragile relationship shattered completely under the strain. Freed from the official duties that had at least given their union a public purpose, they had no reason to maintain the pretense of a happy marriage. They were two strangers, bound by a legal document but separated by a chasm of mutual indifference and resentment. They took up residence in Bucharest, but lived almost entirely separate lives. George spent his time morosely contemplating his political fortunes and communicating with royalist factions back in Greece, while Elizabeth, for the first time in her life, began to forge a path of her own. Without the title of queen, and with no children to raise, Elizabeth found herself with two things she had never truly possessed before: time and a degree of freedom. She turned her sharp, focused mind to a subject that had always been a source of security in her precarious life: money. While her mother, Queen Marie, was famously extravagant, Elizabeth had always been frugal, almost to a fault. Now she began to actively manage her considerable personal fortune. She sought out financial advisors and began making a series of shrewd and sometimes ruthless investments. She bought and sold stocks, invested in various businesses, and carefully managed her portfolio. This foray into the world of finance was highly unusual for a royal woman of her time. It earned her a reputation among the Romanian elite for being avaricious and obsessed with money. Whispers circulated that she was cold-hearted and calculating in her business dealings. But for Elizabeth, financial independence was the ultimate form of power and security in a world that had repeatedly shown her that titles, crowns, and even countries could be lost overnight. Money was tangible. It could not be taken away by a military coup or a plebiscite. Her focus on accumulating wealth was not just greed. It was the strategy of a survivor, a woman determined never to be dependent on anyone, a husband, a family, or a state ever again. As the years of exile dragged on, the marriage became a complete farce. George began spending more and more time abroad, particularly in Great Britain, where he felt more comfortable. He and Elizabeth saw each other less and less. The final inevitable break came in the early 1930s. After years of de facto separation, Elizabeth initiated divorce proceedings. The marriage was formally dissolved on July 6, 1935. The divorce was a scandal in royal circles, but for Elizabeth, it was a release. She was now 40 years old, a divorced ex-queen, a princess with no official role and no direct heir. The path she had been born and bred to follow had led to a dead end. She was finally completely on her own. A few months after their divorce, in a stunning turn of events, The monarchy in Greece was restored, and George II was recalled to the throne. He returned to Athens as king, but he returned alone. Elisabeth, who could have potentially renegotiated her position and returned as queen, showed absolutely no interest. That chapter of her life was definitively and perhaps gratefully closed. She would never set foot in Greece again. After her divorce, Elisabeth remained in Romania, settling into a life of quiet independence at the elegant Elisabetta Palace in Bucharest, a residence that had been built for her. She now styled herself as Princess Elisabeth of Romania, dropping any reference to her former Greek title. For a time it seemed she might find a quiet, if unremarkable, role as a senior member of the Romanian royal family. However, the political and familial landscape of Romania was becoming increasingly toxic. Her older brother, Carol, who had renounced his right to the throne in the 1920s to pursue a scandalous affair with his mistress, Magda Lupescu, had made a dramatic return to the country in 1930 and seized the crown, becoming King Carol II. His reign was marked by corruption, political intrigue, and an increasingly authoritarian style. He established a royal dictatorship in 1938, and his personal life continued to create instability. Elizabeth's relationship with her brother was deeply strained. Carol was wary of any potential rivals within the family, and Elisabeth, with her independent fortune and the lingering prestige of having been a queen, was a figure to be watched. There were rumors, likely unfounded, that she harbored political ambitions of her own, or that she was involved in plots against him. At one point, she was even accused of conspiring with the Iron Guard, a powerful and violent fascist movement that was gaining strength in Romania. While there is no concrete evidence to support these claims, the accusations further poisoned her relationship with Carol and isolated her within the court. She was also deeply estranged from her sister-in-law and former sister-in-law, Princess Helen of Greece, who was now the divorced and much-wronged wife of King Carol II. The two women, once linked by a double marriage, now found themselves on opposite sides of a bitter family feud. Elizabeth, ever the pragmatist, maintained a civil, if not warm, relationship with Carol's infamous mistress, Magda Lupescu, a move that further alienated her from other members of the family who despised Lupescu. As the 1930s drew to a close and the storm clouds of another world war gathered over Europe, Elizabeth's position in Romania became increasingly untenable. The family was fractured, the political situation was explosive, and she was a lonely, distrusted figure. She had her palace, her art, and her fortune, but she had no real place, no sense of belonging. Seeking a life of greater peace, privacy, and perhaps safety, she began to look for an escape. Her gaze fell upon the sunny, fashionable, and politically neutral shores of the French Riviera. Sometime in the late 1930s or early 1940s, Elizabeth made the decision to leave Romania for good. She purchased a magnificent property in Cannes, a fashionable resort town on the French Riviera that had long been a playground for European royalty and aristocracy. Her new home was the Villa Rosalba, a beautiful Belle Epoque mansion surrounded by lush gardens. Here, in the warm Mediterranean sun, she set about creating a new life for herself, a life far removed from the cold, damp palaces and the poisonous political intrigues of the Balkans. She devoted herself to her passions. She established one of the most magnificent gardens in Cannes, spending a great deal of her time and money cultivating rare and beautiful plants. She continued to paint and play the piano. She entertained a small, carefully selected circle of friends, mostly other exiled aristocrats and artists. For a time, it seemed she had finally found a measure of contentment, a quiet, elegant life that she could control. However, the Second World War once again shattered the peace of Europe and threw her life into turmoil. When France fell to the Germans in 1940 and was later occupied, she found herself in a precarious position. Unlike many other wealthy expatriates who fled, Elisabeth remained in Cannes throughout the war. Her villa, a grand and isolated estate, became a self-contained world. There are anecdotal accounts that she used her resources to help those in need during the occupation. Some stories claim that she sheltered a Jewish family, hiding them from the Vichy authorities and the Gestapo. Others suggest she helped members of the French resistance. These stories are difficult to verify with certainty, as Elisabeth was intensely private and left few records of her wartime activities. However, they hint at a quiet courage and a sense of moral duty that lay beneath her famously frosty exterior. After the war, the final ties to her old life were severed. In December 1947, the monarchy in Romania was abolished by the new communist government that had been installed by the Soviet Union. Her nephew, the young King Michael I, was forced to abdicate at gunpoint and sent into exile. All royal properties, including Elisabeth's palace and assets in Romania, were confiscated by the state. She was officially stripped of her Romanian nationality and titles. This event was a profound and final rupture. She was now truly a princess in name only, an exile with no country, no crown, and no family home to return to. The world she had been born into, the world of European royalty, had been almost completely swept away by war and revolution. She was a survivor, a relic from a bygone era, living out her days on the French coast. In her final years in Cannes, Elisabeth became a figure of local legend, a woman who was more myth than reality. She became increasingly reclusive, rarely venturing out from her villa. Her famous frugality hardened into a legendary eccentricity. She was known to be a fiercely demanding employer, counting every lump of sugar and inspecting the household accounts with an eagle eye. She lived a solitary life, her days structured around the quiet routines of her garden, her painting, and her small household. The vibrant, powerful world of her youth, the grand courts, the political dramas, the sense of historical purpose, had evaporated, leaving behind a quiet, empty present. For a woman who had once worn a crown, this slow, inexorable descent into obscurity must have been a profound and painful psychological blow. The walls she had built around herself as a young girl had now become the physical walls of her villa, a gilded cage where she lived out her final lonely years. When we last left Princess Elisabeth, she had found a fragile peace in the sun-drenched sanctuary of her villa in Cannes. The former queen of the Hellenes, the Princess of Romania, had retreated from a world that she felt had no place for her. Her marriage was over, her crown was a distant memory, and the country of her birth was now locked behind an iron curtain. She was a woman adrift, a historical relic living in the modern world. This final chapter of her story is the quietest, but in many ways the most profound. It is a deep dive into the psychology of loneliness, the slow erosion of the self, and the final desperate act of a woman who chose to command her own exit from a life that had been, from the very beginning, commanded for her. The post-war years in Cannes were, for Elisabeth, a long, slow twilight. The Villa Rosalba, once a symbol of her newfound freedom and independence, gradually became a fortress, a beautifully appointed prison where she lived out her days in almost complete seclusion. The vibrant, chaotic world of Balkan politics, the grand state dinners, the fleeting sense of purpose she had found as a wartime nurse, all of it had faded into the realm of memory, leaving behind a vast, echoing silence. Her daily life settled into a rigid, unvarying routine. She would rise early, attend to her correspondence, and then spend hours in her magnificent gardens. Her passion for horticulture was one of the few joys left to her. In the controlled, ordered world of her flower beds and pathways, she could exercise a command that she had never been able to exert over her own life. She would then spend her afternoons painting or playing the piano, the solitary artistic pursuits that had been her refuge since childhood. Her evenings were quiet, usually spent alone with a book. To the outside world, she became an enigma, the eccentric, forgotten princess of Cannes. Local gossip painted a picture of a difficult, miserly old woman. Stories circulated about her legendary frugality, how she would count every sugar cube, inspect every bill, and berate her staff for the slightest extravagance. She was known to be a fiercely demanding employer, her household run with a cold, almost military precision. This reputation for being cold and avaricious, which had followed her throughout her life, now became her defining characteristic in the small world she inhabited. But beneath this frosty exterior lay a profound and consuming loneliness. The few people who were admitted into her small circle described a woman haunted by the past, prone to long bouts of melancholy. She was cut off from the family that remained. Her beloved mother, Queen Marie, had died in 1938. Her brother Carol, himself in exile, was a disgraced figure. Her nephew, the young King Michael, was also in exile, struggling to make a new life for himself. The grand family reunions of her youth were a thing of the past. She was, in a very real sense, utterly alone. Her health, both physical and mental, began to decline. The various ailments that had plagued her during her time in Greece returned. She suffered from chronic pain and increasing frailty, but the deeper ailment was in her spirit. She was a woman whose entire identity had been forged in a world that no longer existed. She had been raised for one purpose: to be a queen. When that purpose was stripped away, she was left with a void that she could never fill. Her shrewd financial investments had given her security, but they could not buy her happiness or a reason to live. She was, as one observer noted, one of the richest and loneliest women in Europe. As the mid-1950s dawned, this profound sense of purposelessness and isolation seemed to crystallize into a quiet, settled despair. She was now in her early 60s, her world having shrunk to the confines of her villa and its gardens. The past was a gallery of ghosts, and the future held nothing but the promise of more empty days. It was from this place of deep existential weariness that she made her final decision. On November 14, 1956, Princess Elisabeth of Romania was found dead in her bed by her staff. The official cause of death released to the public was a heart attack, a quiet, respectable end for a woman of her rank. But this was a gentle fiction, a final veil of royal propriety drawn over a much sadder truth. The reality, widely understood by those close to the situation and later confirmed, was that she had taken her own life with a carefully planned overdose of barbiturates. There was no note, no final dramatic gesture. Her suicide was as quiet, as deliberate, and as private as the life she had been living for decades. It was the ultimate act of a woman who had spent a lifetime building walls around her sealed book of a heart. She had chosen the time and the manner of her own death, the final, absolute assertion of control in a life where she had felt she had so little. Her funeral was a small, quiet affair. She was buried in the Russian Orthodox cemetery in Cannes, a solitary grave for a solitary woman, a world away from the royal crypts in Bucharest and Athens where she was born to lie. It was a silent end to a life that had begun with the fanfare of royal salutes, a life of immense privilege that had ultimately led to a place of unbearable pain. To simply label Elisabeth as a tragic victim is to do her a disservice. Her life was a tragedy, but she was a complex and often difficult protagonist in her own story. The central historical debate surrounding her is not about her actions, but about her character. Was she, as so many of her contemporaries described her, a genuinely cold, avaricious, and haughty woman? Or was this frosty exterior an elaborate lifelong suit of armor built to protect a deeply wounded and sensitive soul? The truth, as is so often the case, likely lies somewhere in between. The evidence for the cold queen is plentiful. Her own mother, Queen Marie, the person who should have known her best, consistently described her as difficult, secretive, and emotionally inaccessible. During her time in Greece, she made almost no effort to connect with the people or her husband. Her public demeanor often described as sullen and arrogant. Her later life in Cannes, with her reputation for miserliness and her harsh treatment of her staff, seems to support this view. From this perspective, Elisabeth was a woman who, soured by early disappointments, allowed bitterness and a love of money to become the defining features of her character. However, a more compassionate interpretation sees this coldness not as her true nature, but as a tragic defense mechanism. Consider the psychological landscape of her childhood. She was the ugly duckling in a family that prized beauty, the quiet introvert overshadowed by a charismatic, world-famous mother. She was constantly compared to her prettier, more charming sisters. From a very young age, she learned that she could not compete on their terms. So she withdrew. The coldness was a shield. The aloofness was a way of saying, I will reject you before you can reject me. Her secretiveness was a way of protecting an inner world that she felt no one, not even her own mother, could understand or appreciate. From this viewpoint, her actions take on a different meaning. Her failure to adapt in Greece was not just arrogance. It was the terrified retreat of a deeply insecure woman thrust into a hostile environment. Her obsession with money was not just greed. It was a desperate search for security by a woman whose entire world had been proven to be frighteningly insecure. The queen who could be exiled and the princess who could be stripped of her title needed something tangible, something that could not be taken away by political whims. Her life was a cascade of losses. She lost the affection and understanding of her mother. She lost the love she may have hoped for in a marriage that was a cold political transaction. She lost her crown and her position. She lost her country. She lost her family home. Viewed through this lens, her difficult personality is not a character flaw, but a scar, the inevitable result of a lifetime of emotional trauma and profound disappointment. She was not born cold. She was made cold, forged in the fires of expectation and the ice of loneliness. This interpretation does not excuse her behavior, but it allows us to understand it and to see the deeply wounded soul that she kept so carefully hidden from the world. Princess Elisabeth of Romania's significance lies not in her actions, but in what her life represents, the human cost of dynastic politics at the end of an era. She was a living sacrifice to statecraft. Her unhappy and politically motivated marriage to George II of Greece, serving a Balkan alliance that ultimately proved worthless. This personal tragedy illustrates the immense psychological pressure placed on royals ill-suited for their roles. Her subsequent long, aimless exile further transformed her into a symbol of her class's growing irrelevance in the 20th century. A queen without a kingdom and a relic of a lost world, her journey from a Carpathian castle to a lonely villa in Cannes mirrors the decline of the European monarchical system itself. Perhaps her most enduring legacy, however, is as a profound cautionary tale about loneliness and the search for identity. Elizabeth's life was defined by a deep sense of isolation, as her entire identity was built upon external roles: princess, queen, wife. When these titles were stripped away by political turmoil, she was left adrift, with no strong sense of self to anchor her. Having never been allowed to discover who Elizabeth was separate from her royal designations, her story is a heartbreaking reminder that the fundamental human need for an internal purpose and identity cannot be fulfilled by any amount of wealth or privilege. In the end, Princess Elisabeth of Romania remains a complex and deeply tragic figure. She was not a simple victim. Her difficult personality and her own choices certainly played a part in the trajectory of her unhappy life. But she was also a woman profoundly shaped and ultimately broken by the extraordinary and often cruel circumstances of her birth and station. Her life is a somber reminder that behind the grand titles, the glittering facades, and the dry facts of history, there are real human beings with all their frailties, their insecurities, and their unfulfilled longings. She was born and bred for a single purpose, to be a queen, but she found the role to be an empty, painful one. She spent the rest of her life searching for a new part to play, only to find that the world had moved on and written her out of the script. Her quiet, deliberate exit from the world was the final act of a woman who had long felt invisible. It was the ultimate retreat for a princess who, after a lifetime of feeling like an outsider, a ghost in her own story, finally chose to disappear completely. Her story is a quiet, haunting echo from the past, a powerful testament to a life of immense privilege and even greater pain, and the enduring tragedy of the forgotten queen.